The morning sky over the outskirts of Cleveland hung in a flat sheet of gray. A black electric sport utility vehicle moved along a service road lined with closed warehouses, body shops, and weathered fuel stations. Inside the rear cabin sat Scarlett Whitmore, 28 years old, Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore Precision. Dressed in a tailored black dress with a deep neckline, her chestnut brown hair falling loose, a tablet glowing against her crossed knee. Her mind was on the meeting that waited at the end of the drive, a contract renewal worth $40 million with a commercial logistics partner whose patience had been thinning for months. The renewal mattered more than the figure alone suggested. The bank that had financed Whitmore Precision's expansion into commercial electric drivetrain components was watching the same paperwork from the other side, and if the contract slipped, the bank would have every reason to call in covenants the company could not yet meet. The dashboard chimed twice. A warning bloomed across the driver's display in clean white letters. Drive unit thermal shutdown. The vehicle slowed of its own accord, power tapering away even as the driver pressed harder on the pedal. He guided the SUV to the shoulder. 2 hours, the dispatcher said over the phone. The certified service team was busy on another call. 2 hours was forever, when the meeting was in 50 minutes, and the partner was already suspicious of Whitmore's reliability. The driver glanced at the lot ahead, where a small fuel station sat tucked at the corner of the road, and behind it, half hidden under a leaning aluminum overhang, stood a garage with hand-painted letters across a wooden sign, Mercer Auto and Electric Repair. Scarlett looked once at the cracked concrete apron, the silver paint-scuffed roll-up door, the toolboxes stacked beside a single old lift, and a faint, dismissive smile curled at the edge of her mouth. A man stepped out of the bay, wiping his hands on a clean shop rag. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, his dark brown hair cut close, his eyes calm and patient in a way that had been earned rather than chosen. His shop shirt was the color of weathered slate, his jeans dark with old oil that no longer stained. He looked at the SUV, then at Scarlett, then at the warning still glowing on the dashboard. His voice, when he spoke, was low and even, asking what the vehicle had reported. Scarlett did not bother to soften her tone. "A place like this," she said, loud enough for the driver and the assistant in the front seat to hear, could probably handle a riding mower. A Whitmore drivetrain was something else entirely. She did not laugh out loud. Her amusement stayed at the edges of her mouth, the kind of casual cruelty that powerful people sometimes mistake for honesty. From the small office at the back of the garage, a child stepped quietly into the doorway. She was 6 years old, her wheat-colored hair pinned with a slightly crooked clip, a worn stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest. Grace Mercer had heard every word. The bright, shy expression she had been wearing 2 seconds before slid quietly off her face. She looked up at her father, then at the woman in the black dress, and then at her own shoes. Caleb Mercer did not move for a moment. The insult had not surprised him, but the small change in his daughter's expression had landed somewhere he did not know could still bruise. He had been spoken down to many times in his life, and he had developed a quiet armor for it. He had no armor for the look on Grace's face. He knelt in front of her, adjusted the soft jacket collar that had folded under itself, and spoke just loud enough for her to hear. "A place is not ugly," he told her, simply because someone has not yet understood it. She nodded once, the way a child nods when she is trying very hard to believe what an adult is telling her, and went back into the office to her drawing pad. Caleb rose, looked at Scarlett, and said he would only need 30 minutes. If he did not find the cause in that time, she did not have to pay anything at all. The driver glanced at his employer, hoping. Scarlett let a small exhale escape, somewhere between scoff and surrender, and waved her permission with 2 fingers. She folded her arms across the top of her purse and stood near the open bay door, as if she were watching a performance she had already reviewed and rated low. Caleb opened the hood with the calm of someone who had opened 10,000 hoods. He did not reach immediately for his diagnostic tool. He listened first. He asked the driver to switch the system back on, without pressing the accelerator, and he placed an open palm above the drive unit housing, feeling for the small whisper of warmth that should have settled evenly and was not. He bent close and smelled the faint, sweet odor of overheated polymer, the kind that lingers near a sensor wire that had been hotter than the dashboard ever knew. Then he plugged in his diagnostic reader. The reader was several generations behind the manufacturer's preferred unit. Scarlett's eyes flicked over it with the kind of professional disdain that only a chief executive could muster for an item smaller than a paperback. Caleb did not notice. He was scrolling through fault histories that the dashboard had not bothered to surface, the small ghost codes that engineers usually called noise, and that experienced hands sometimes called the truth. The battery was healthy. The main control software was intact. The drive motor was unblemished. The problem sat in a single component inside the thermal regulation chain, a small valve responsible for opening when heat climbed under heavy load. The valve was opening, the data said, but slowly, a delay of several seconds at the precise moment those seconds mattered. To a passenger car under gentle acceleration, the delay would never matter. To a commercial unit under repeated rapid load shifts, the delay let heat collect just long enough for the central sensor to read past its safety ceiling and order the entire drivetrain to back away. Caleb explained it to the driver in the plain language he always used. The vehicle was not weak, he said. It was being suffocated, very briefly, in the same part that was supposed to keep it cool. Then it was being told to shut down for a fault that was not really its own. Scarlett did not move, but the small smile at the corner of her mouth thinned. Those words were not abstract to her. They matched, almost line for line, complaints that had been coming into her company's customer service department for months. Complaints she had been told to manage as isolated misuse cases. He worked steadily for the next half hour. He removed a small cover, cleaned a contact surface that had collected an invisible film of oxidation, recalibrated the response curve on the affected sensor with a manual adjustment most factory technicians had been trained to skip, and reseated the lower harness. He asked the driver to power up again. The dashboard ran its diagnostic sweep, paused on the fault for one careful breath, and then cleared. The SUV rolled forward under its own power and idled with the smooth, low hum the marketing material had always promised. The assistant glanced up from her phone, surprised against her will. The driver tested the throttle in small bursts, then stronger ones, and the warning did not return. Grace stepped halfway into the bay doorway, and the look of pride on her face was so quick and so unguarded that Caleb almost missed it. Scarlett did not miss it. Something inside her registered the moment, refused it, and looked away. She paid him in cash from a small leather wallet, and as she handed over the bills, she allowed her voice to harden one more time. Fixing one car, she said, did not mean he understood a factory. He should not confuse the small garage he stood in with the real world. Caleb did not answer. He folded the bills, set them on the workbench, and watched the SUV pull away. Behind him, Grace stepped out of the office and asked, in a voice that was very small, why the woman still seemed angry when her car worked again. Caleb did not know how to answer. He only knew that from that morning forward, he could not afford to be a man whose daughter doubted him. The meeting in the partner's glass office across town did not go well for Scarlett. She projected confidence the way she always did, in the controlled rhythm of someone trained for boardrooms since adolescence. But the partner's questions kept landing on the same bruises. Why were there so many thermal shutdown reports out of certain commercial fleets? Why were the field engineers blaming customer driving habits when the same complaint kept arriving from drivers who had spent 20 years behind a wheel? Scarlett had answers prepared. She delivered them. The partner nodded politely, signed nothing, and asked to follow up next quarter. Whitmore Precision had not been a healthy company for almost a year, and Scarlett knew it. Her father had built the firm over 4 decades from a single machining shop into a regional supplier of precision parts. After his sudden death 2 winters earlier, she had taken his chair with a strategic plan he had never approved, redirecting the company's capacity toward commercial electric drivetrain assemblies and borrowing aggressively to install new lines. The numbers on paper had been beautiful. The numbers in the field had not stayed beautiful. Victor Grant, the chief financial officer, sat across from her in the back of the car as they drove away from the partner's office. He was 52, lean, careful. He did not raise his voice. He never had to. He laid out, in soft and exact sentences, the position of the bank, the schedule of covenants tied to the new line, and the conclusion any of those creditors might draw, if the $40 million contract slipped beyond the next 2 quarters. Scarlett listened without looking at him. Inside the engineering wing of Whitmore Precision, a younger engineer named Amanda Reeves had been carrying a folder for some months. The folder contained measurements she had taken during pre-production testing on the new commercial drivetrain assemblies, measurements that quietly documented an irregular response time in the thermal regulation valve under rapid load variation. She had filed the folder, presented its summary, and watched as it was set aside in the rush to meet shipping commitments. Amanda Reeves had simply kept the folder. That night, after the last customer had paid for an oil change and the streetlights had come on along the road in front of the small fuel station, Caleb sat at the long workbench at the back of his garage. Grace was asleep on the worn couch in the corner of the office. Her rabbit curled into the bend of her arm. The lamp on the bench cast a warm circle of light over a battered notebook and a folder of fault logs Caleb had been collecting for the better part of a year. He flipped through the logs slowly. The SUV that had appeared in his bay that morning was not the first vehicle to come through his doors with the same complaint, only the most expensive. 5 fleet vehicles in the last 7 months had carried the same family of fault codes. All used drivetrain assemblies sourced from Whitmore Precision. All had been told by their authorized dealers to either wait several weeks for parts or replace the entire assembly at considerable expense. The pattern was not a coincidence. It was a design weakness wearing a sticker that read driver error. He could pick up the phone and tell someone. He could call a reporter, send a letter to a regulator, post the fault logs publicly. He could let the small wound from that morning push him into a public fight. He sat with that option for a long time, and then he closed it. A loud accusation from a garage with 1 lift would not weigh much against a company with lawyers. It would also be a fight Grace would watch him have. He picked up the notebook and turned to a fresh page. He wrote 1 sentence at the top. 90 days. He did not write threats. He did not write speeches. He wrote a list. Days 1 through 30, identify the root cause and build a working prototype. Days 31 through 45, install the prototype on actual customer vehicles with permission and document every result. Days 46 through 60, standardize the procedure, build a small inventory, and treat the operation as a real shop. Days 61 through 75, sign service agreements with real commercial fleets. Days 76 through 90, secure outside capital and prepare to absorb whatever the larger market shed. He did not know on that first night that he would buy a factory. He only knew that if Whitmore Precision continued to deny what its customers were experiencing, the market would eventually demand someone willing to repair what was actually broken, and he intended to be that person. The first 30 days were not heroic. They were tired. He continued to take ordinary work during the day because the bills did not pause for ambition, and Grace needed groceries more than she needed a father chasing legends. At night, after she had brushed her teeth and chosen which book she wanted him to read to her, he returned to the workbench and worked until his eyes refused him. He sold the second pickup he had been holding on to and used the money to buy a better thermal imaging camera, additional pressure sensors, a small load bench, and 3 damaged drivetrain assemblies that a salvage yard was willing to part with for very little. The garage began to change. Schematics covered an entire wall. Cardboard boxes received careful labels written by Grace in colored markers. One carried in her handwriting the title, Dad's Big Fix. There were nights when his prototype shorted out. There were nights when his measurements contradicted everything he had assumed 12 hours earlier. By the 24th night, he had a small device the size of a man's palm, a secondary thermal regulator that responded faster than the original valve and bled excess heat away from the sensitive sensor before the main system could panic into a shutdown. The original drivetrain stayed intact. Nothing essential was removed. The new device sat humbly in line, like a translator standing between 2 parts that had stopped listening to each other. By the end of the 30th day, he could install the prototype in just under 1 hour, and the modified assemblies he had wired into the load bench held their performance through repeated cycles that had previously caused them to fail. On the morning of the 45th day, a man pulled into the lot in a commercial van that had no working drivetrain. His name was Brandon Hale. He was 42, with a tired face and a worn cap that read Hale Logistics across the front. He ran a small fleet that delivered medical supplies on contract for a regional hospital system, and his largest contract required him to keep at least 3 vehicles on the road at all hours. 2 of his vans had been off the road for almost 3 weeks. The authorized service center had told him the next available appointment was 21 days out. Brandon Hale was going to lose his contract. He had heard about Caleb through a chain of phone calls that had not started with strangers. He stepped down from the cab, walked into the bay, and asked, with the bluntness of a man with nothing left to lose, whether Caleb could keep his vehicles running. Caleb did not promise anything. He asked Brandon to sign a single-page agreement that explained, in clear language, that the work was experimental, that data would be collected before and after, and that if the device did not perform under real conditions, Caleb would remove it at no charge. Brandon read the page once and signed it. Caleb installed the device that afternoon, took baseline measurements, ran the van through a 30-mile loop with a deliberately mixed load profile, recorded the results, and handed Brandon a printed log along with the keys. "Use it the way you usually use it," he said. "Bring it back in 7 days." The next morning the van rolled out before dawn, and it stayed on the road. The drivetrain held its temperature through every stop and start, every loaded climb, every long idle in a hospital loading dock. After 7 days, Brandon brought it back, brought the second van as well, and then brought a third. The work cost him a fraction of what a dealer assembly replacement would have cost. He asked, almost shyly, whether he could tell other fleet owners about what he had seen. Caleb said yes. He simply understood that a working answer to a real problem moves through a market faster than any complaint ever could. Within 2 weeks, Brandon's quiet endorsement passed from fleet manager to fleet manager in the small private community of people who actually drove the vehicles the city depended on, had brought 5 other fleet owners to the garage door. Each one signed the same agreement. Each one drove away with a working van and a printed log. Each one began telling someone else. By the morning of the 60th day, Caleb understood that he could not continue to be a single technician working at night. The demand had outgrown his hands. He filed paperwork for a small business and named the company Mercer Thermal Systems. He kept the original garage as the operating address, but he reorganized the space with the seriousness of a man who knew that small mistakes scale faster than small successes. He divided the bay into clear zones for receiving, measurement, assembly, quality testing, and packing. Each device was hand-built and serial numbered. 2 finished units were tested for every one shipped. He wrote a 1-page warranty in language a fleet manager could read in 3 minutes, and he signed every warranty himself. He hired 2 new employees. One was a machinist named Dale Whitfield, 61 years old, who had been laid off from Whitmore Precision in a cost reduction wave 18 months earlier, despite a perfect record. The other was a quality inspector named Renee Patterson, 44 years old, who had been similarly cut. Both had been told that their experience could be replaced by software and younger hires. Caleb told them, in the very first conversation, that he had hired them for what they knew and that he intended to listen to them. Grace watched all of this from her corner of the office. She helped label boxes with her colored markers and left small drawings on the workbench when her father worked late. She did not understand contracts or covenants or thermal valves, but she understood that the place once called ugly was now full of people who treated it like it mattered. Caleb did not try to take over the entire electric vehicle industry. He took the one corner of the market that was in active pain, commercial fleets in the Midwest that used Whitmore drivetrain assemblies and could not wait 21 days for an authorized appointment. That corner was small in the language of analysts. It was enormous in the language of people whose vans had to roll at 5 in the morning. The corner did not need a big factory. It needed a trustworthy answer. Inside Whitmore Precision, the change was not invisible. Customer service began noticing fleet owners declining warranty appointments. Dealers began complaining that customers were taking their vans elsewhere. A name began appearing in reports that no one in the executive wing had heard before: Mercer Thermal Systems. The same surname stenciled on a small garage sign behind a fuel station. Scarlett saw the name for the first time in a weekly summary, and her mouth tightened in a way she would not have admitted to a mirror. 2 weeks later, she ordered her driver to take her there. The lot looked different when she arrived. 3 vans were queued along the side wall, each with their fleet logos visible. Inside the bay, 2 technicians moved with the unhurried rhythm of people who knew exactly what they were doing. The walls were covered with serial number charts. The little cardboard sign in Grace's handwriting still hung where it had always hung, but next to it now were printed customer logs, a posted warranty, and a board listing the production targets for the week. Scarlett stepped inside in a deep red dress that fit her like a quiet declaration, her chestnut hair pinned at the side, her heels clicking against the concrete. She did not smile this time. Grace recognized her at once and stepped a little closer to her father, holding the rabbit a little tighter. Caleb laid a hand briefly on his daughter's shoulder. He did not need to teach her to hate the woman in the red dress. He only needed her to see how an adult could be unafraid without being cruel. Scarlett did not waste time on preamble. She offered $500,000 for the design, a 6-month consulting agreement with a generous salary attached, and a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent him from selling the device directly to any third party while she absorbed the technology into Whitmore Precision's official line. She told him, with the steady voice of an executive who had practiced this conversation in a mirror, that this was a generous resolution. He could close his garage with dignity and stop pretending he could compete with a factory. Caleb listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question. If he signed her contract, would Whitmore Precision openly tell every fleet customer that the original assemblies carried a design weakness in the thermal regulator? Scarlett did not answer immediately. She said something about phased communication, about protecting shareholders, about not causing unnecessary panic. He told her, calmly, that she did not want to buy a solution. She wanted to buy a silence. He told her that fleets did not need her quiet. They needed their vans to roll. He told her that the garage she had laughed at had become the answer to a problem her company had refused to admit, and that no amount of money would make him hide that answer behind a paper. Scarlett's color rose. She accused him of grandstanding. She said that a small garage could not replace a factory. Caleb did not raise his voice. "The market does not need the largest factory," he said. "It needs the most trustworthy one." Scarlett left without saying goodbye. When the SUV pulled away, Grace let out a small breath she had been holding. Caleb knelt and told her, gently, that the woman was not angry at her. The woman was angry at the truth, and the truth had a habit of taking time before people made friends with it. The next weeks were not kind to Whitmore Precision. Scarlett ordered her engineering team to deliver a rapid patch. They did. The patch lowered the surface temperature at the sensor by a measurable amount, but because it did not address the slow opening of the regulator valve, it bought only weeks rather than the months it claimed to buy. A regional delivery fleet that operated more than 200 vehicles equipped with Whitmore assemblies hit a stretch of peak season volume in early winter, and within 10 days, 17 of those vehicles had been pulled off the road with the same family of fault codes that the patch was supposed to have ended. The story moved through the channels that matter in a niche industry. Local trade journals picked it up. Fleet associations sent angry letters. Dealers began copying their grievances upward in writing. The name Mercer Thermal Systems began appearing in trade articles next to Whitmore Precision, and the comparison was not flattering to the larger company. Victor Grant called an emergency executive meeting and laid the consequences out without softening anything. The $40 million contract had not been renewed. The partner had quietly written its decision into a paragraph buried in a routine letter. With that contract gone, several covenants tied to the new production line crossed into default territory. The bank, Victor explained, would no longer permit Whitmore Precision to operate as if the line were a permanent asset. The line would have to be sold, or the company would have to be sold. Scarlett tried to argue. She talked about brand resilience, about market memory, about consumer cycles. An older board member, a man named Harlan Brooks, who had served alongside her father from the company's earliest years, finally cleared his throat and spoke for the first time. "Your father," he said, "built this company by listening to the people who stood closest to the machines. When did we begin laughing at them?" The room went quiet. Amanda Reeves, sitting in the back as an invited specialist, opened the folder she had been carrying for almost a year and slid it across the table. The original measurement records on the thermal regulator were inside. The internal date stamps were old enough to make every executive in the room look very tired. Scarlett opened the cover, read 3 pages, and closed it again. She did not speak for the rest of the meeting. Henry Cole had been watching Mercer Thermal Systems for almost a month before he drove to the small garage in person. He was 48, a partner at a clean technology fund based in Columbus, careful with money and unsentimental about stories. He had not come because Caleb was a single father. He had come because the operational data that Brandon Hale and the other early fleet customers had been quietly compiling showed real cost reductions, real uptime improvements, and a real failure rate decrease across thousands of miles of roadwork. He spent half a day in the bay. He asked questions that proved he had read the warranty before he stepped through the door. He spoke to Dale Whitfield and Renee Patterson and listened to them more carefully than he listened to Caleb. At the end of the visit, he offered an investment that would give Caleb the capital to scale the operation honestly. There was one quiet condition. Henry would expect Caleb to consider acquiring distressed manufacturing assets if they came onto the market in the region. The condition was not pressure. It was foresight. They both knew which factory was likely to become available. Days passed. The auction filings came faster than Scarlett had let herself expect. The bank scheduled a structured asset sale of the new production line and the surrounding facility. There were not many bidders willing to absorb a facility tied to a public failure. The only bidder who had the inventory of signed fleet contracts, the operational data to justify continued use of the line, and outside capital ready to deploy, was the man Scarlett had once told to confine himself to riding mowers. The closing happened in a glass conference room overlooking the still floor of the Whitmore Precision plant. Caleb wore a clean, dark shirt and a quiet jacket. He had not tried to costume himself into a different man for the occasion. Grace sat next to him in a small chair pulled close, with her rabbit on her lap. Henry Cole sat to one side as the representative of the fund. Victor Grant sat opposite. Scarlett sat at the end of the table in a charcoal suit, her hair pulled back into a low knot, her hands very still on the closed folder in front of her. The attorneys read paragraphs. Signatures were collected. When the closing was complete, the lead attorney announced, in the flat voice that attorneys use for moments other people will remember, that ownership of the line, the facility, and the equipment had passed to Mercer Thermal Systems. The room did not erupt. There was no applause. There was only the quiet shift of pages and a long exhalation from Victor Grant that nobody acknowledged. Scarlett looked across the table at Caleb. The man she had once called a small garage operator owned her father's factory. Caleb did not smile. He did not stand and offer a barbed parting line. He signed the last copy of the final document, slid the folder back to the attorney, and looked down at the silent floor below the conference room with the careful eyes of someone who understood that the win was now a responsibility. The workers below, who had been told to gather at noon for the announcement, did not know yet that they were going to keep their jobs. After the signing, Scarlett walked alone down a hallway lined with photographs of the company's history. Halfway along the wall, she found a portrait of her father from the year he had opened the first production line, standing in front of the original lathe in a stained shopcoat, his hands marked by the kind of permanent darkness that no soap ever fully removes. Beneath the portrait, a small brass plate carried a sentence he had said often enough that it had been engraved as a motto. Never laugh at the person who stands closer to the machine than you do. She stopped in front of it for a long time. She remembered the morning 2 months earlier when she had stood in the cracked apron of a small garage and decided, before she had spoken a single word to him, that the man inside that bay was beneath her concern. The grief that arrived in her chest was older than the grief of losing a company. It was the grief of recognizing that she had become exactly the type of leader he had once warned her in a quiet kitchen on a Sunday morning, when she was 16 years old, never to become. She found Caleb outside the front of the facility before he left. The light was the same flat gray it had been on the day they first met. She did not have a speech prepared. She told him, in plain language, that she had judged him by the cracked concrete of his apron and the dust on his shop shirt, and that she had been completely wrong. Her largest mistake had not been a technical one. Her largest mistake had been deciding to stop listening to the truth, because the truth was inconvenient. She apologized without dressing it up. Caleb listened without interrupting. When she had finished, He answered her in the same quiet voice he had used in his garage. He had not bought the factory to prove that she was small. He had bought it to prove that a small place can still build something large. He told her that if she ever wanted to learn the floor of her father's company again, the door would not be closed to her. Then he wished her well, walked to the curb where Grace and Henry were waiting, and did not look back. The next morning, a maintenance crew arrived at the front of the building and lowered the old Whitmore Precision sign from the wall above the lobby. A new sign rose in its place that read, simply, Mercer Drive Works. The workers gathered below, several of them holding the same termination letters that had been quietly handed out 3 months earlier in anticipation of a sale to a buyer who would have stripped the floor for parts. Caleb stepped out to face them. He did not speak from a prepared statement. The factory, he said, was not going to close. The line that had been built to make commercial drivetrain assemblies was going to keep making them, although the design would change in ways the engineering team would now be permitted to discuss openly. The 2 technicians who had stood with him in the small garage would not be sent home. The workers who had been laid off in the cost reduction wave would be invited to apply for return. Amanda Reeves would head a new internal quality program with the authority to halt production if her measurements warranted it. Every field complaint, from a fleet, from a dealer, from a driver, from a mechanic, would be logged, read, and answered because no brand was ever larger than the truth that its customers were trying to tell it. He did not promise that the next year would be easy. He told them only that nobody at the new Mercer Drive Works would ever be told their experience could be replaced by software, and that nobody would be asked to bury a problem to protect a quarter. The crowd did not cheer. The crowd nodded. In a working town, a nod is the highest form of agreement. Grace stood at the edge of the small group, looking up at the new sign with the careful concentration of a child trying to read a word she had only ever heard spoken. She slipped her small hand into her father's and asked the question she had been holding inside her chest for 90 days. So, she said, the little garage. It won, didn't it? Caleb looked down at her, and the smile that crossed his face was very small and very tired and very real. No, sweetheart, he told her. It did not win. It only grew up. He did not close the original garage behind the fuel station. He kept the wooden sign, the silver paint-scuffed roll-up door, and the small bench where he had written the words 90 days on a cold night when his daughter was sleeping against a stuffed rabbit and the world had not yet learned his name. He told the new staff that the building would remain in use as a community service bay where any neighborhood vehicle could be repaired at fair cost and where any young person who wanted to learn the trade could come and stand close enough to a machine to actually hear it. On a quiet evening some weeks later, Caleb stood in the doorway of that original garage with Grace beside him, looking across the side road toward the bright lights of the new factory beyond the trees. The sign for Mercer Drive Works glowed steady against the dark. He did not think about Scarlett. He did not think about the meeting that had been lost or the contracts that had been won. He thought about a small voice from a cold morning asking whether the place that 2 people called home was ugly. He thought about how a man answers that question, not once, but every day, until the answer is no longer a sentence, but a life. Grace pressed closer against his side, the rabbit tucked under her chin. The small garage stood quietly behind them, its single lift still bearing the same silver scuffs, its concrete apron still cracked exactly where it had cracked years before, and yet somehow looking, in the soft fall of the early evening light, like the most honest building on the entire road.